Emotional authenticity is built off four pillars: truth, responsibility, healing, and forgiveness. All of us are in as I say, and I point out and can show it conclusively, the single greatest killer on the planet today is denial and self-deception. We are not in truth. On average, the most truthful human lies 10 to 200 times a day. Simple things about not working out, whatever it may be. Those are lies. If you've ever taken a picture and then you've put filters on it, you're lying.
Yeah.
That's deception. Like there are all of these societal ways that are built into our structure where we lie nonstop. It's pure self-deception. We're not authentic. We don't know how to be. And so we don't even know that we're in deception. And so the first step is to get into truth. Well, how do you get into truth? You have to take responsibility that if there's a problem in your life, you played a part in it. It's not just the other person. It's also you. Well, how do you discover both of those? You have to get into healing. And once we do those three, then we can not only forgive our perpetrators, but most of all, like you said about your parenting, you can heal the shame wound in the childhood wound by forgiving yourself. And that emotional intelligence doesn't give you any of that or any process. It's the border of the puzzle. It opens the door for people to think about emotions and be okay with emotions, which is groundbreaking. Like, I don't want to minimize their impact because now companies, everybody loves, I'm EQ. Like, that's wonderful that it's okay to mention that. But as far as a process that actually provides emotional intelligence, it doesn't provide it.
Yeah. I want to talk to you today about emotional authenticity. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask you, what is it exactly, and how is it different from emotional intelligence?
Great question. The simplest way to explain the difference is to think of a puzzle. What's the first thing you do when you build a puzzle? The border, right?
Yes, if you're smart, yes.
Yeah, in part because it's so easy, right? Doesn't require much effort. But if all you did was the border, would you have the full picture?
Not at all.
That's the difference between emotional intelligence and emotional authenticity. Emotional intelligence gives you the border. Emotional authenticity gives you the full picture. I mean, look, I wouldn't have a career if they hadn't coined that phrase and made it socially acceptable for us to talk about emotions. So I'm not always the best communicator. When I talk, I get so excited that sometimes I could be condescending. It's not my intent. So if any of that comes out, that's just my trauma that I'm still working on. But their process was based off a schematic of the brain that was disproven before the book was ever written. So that's one of the problems. The other thing is they lightly suggest that if you have an emotional reaction, it might be something from your childhood. Like, they don't give you any process to actually achieve the four areas of emotional intelligence that they claim. Well, emotional authenticity, it's simple. Anytime you have an emotional reaction, you're always reliving your childhood. They don't tell you that. Emotional authenticity shows you the science of all emotions are learned. We're not born with them. And so they are constructs that come from the state, the condition our body's in, the childhood, the parents we were raised by, and then society, the definitions of what was going on in society. And so whenever you react, you ask yourself three questions. What am I feeling? And then I provide a feelings wheel for all my clients or people in my classes. So one thing people don't realize is, and another thing emotional intelligence doesn't tell you, is 70% of the people on the planet don't even feel. They're that detached emotionally. So they begin by developing what's called specificity and granularity to their emotions. They begin learning. So they look at that wheel, and it starts off very simple in the middle, good, happy, sad, scared, things like that. But as you get further in the wheel and as you grow in your emotional authenticity, bad becomes consternated, frustrated, irritated. Well, each one of those has a different feeling marker to it. So the next question you ask yourself is, where in my body do I feel it? Because we store all emotional trauma in our body.
Mhm.
Then you ask yourself, what's my first memory of having this thought of, say, irritation, this feeling in my body, which maybe is in my shoulder, my stomach, whatever. What's my first memory of that? And I tell people, write it down. It's usually something in the last 2 to 5 years, pretty recent.
Mhm.
Okay, write the next one down, that the memory before that. And you keep tracing it back, and eventually you remember, I was 4 years old and I wanted a cookie, or I wanted to play something, or um, whatever it was. That's where you learned that emotional feeling. And so you're reliving your childhood trauma against yourself every time you do that. And then emotional authenticity, which emotional intelligence doesn't provide, is a process to restructure that emotional feeling marker. So it stops working, it starts to work for you and no longer works against you, because emotions are basically built off what's called a concept, a simulation, concept, and definition. And so when you have that moment, well, let me say a little bit more. The first 7 years of life, we're in a theta brainwave state. It's which is the same as hypnosis.
Mhm.
So all we're doing is downloading the emotions of those around us in the society, mostly our parents. So that's what's creating the simulation, concept, and definition of emotional concepts. So, like I use this example in my house, table manners. If you chewed with your mouth open or talked with your mouth full, my dad went ballistic. So the simulation, concept, and definition is poor table manners means shame, and you're not accepted in this family. Well, somebody who grew up in the East, China or Japan, if you don't slurp your food and if their stuff isn't flying, well, now you're being rude. And so they
Mhm.
have a different simulation, concept, and definition for that emotion. And so it's much more involved in that. And there are many other aspects and ways. Actually, on my website, I showed 10 ways in which, and in my latest book, Your Journey to Yourself, I give a complete breakdown of the differences between emotional intelligence, emotional authenticity. Also, the most popular therapy out there is cognitive behavioral therapy. And all
Mhm.
that does is suppress emotions. Yet every
Mhm.
single thought and action we ever take always starts with an emotion or feeling. So it's a band-aid approach. It's not dealing with the real issue. And that's why it's very limited in its
Yeah.
overall success. It can be helpful, but you're
Yeah.
not dealing with the root cause of your struggle. So
I
that's a
totally
short over.
agree with you on the CBT, and that's something that was used on me, a form of it anyway, for years, and
Yeah.
it never worked. All it did was it kind of changed my behavior for a time, and then as soon as I kind of relaxed again, I would just go right back to the way I was because it wasn't changing who I was on the inside. It was just, like you said, a band-aid solution. So that really brings me to my next question, and I love how you said that emotions or feelings, they really are feelings because we have them in our body. But I wanted to ask you, you say you become what you feel, not what you think. Can you
Yeah.
elaborate on that?
Yeah, we've known for decades neuroscientifically that feeling comes a split second, or not even, like milliseconds before any thought. Every thought starts with an emotional or a feeling reaction. And so that's my frustration in the personal development field. Almost all of it is geared around changing your thoughts. It's a complete waste of time. Even as you're sitting there generating a thought, that thought is happening from a feeling. And here's a perfect example. I wrote about this in my latest book. I was trying to describe this process, and besides just science, because people don't care about the neuroscience and all that stuff. You know, well, I went downstairs to make coffee because I was frustrated I, I, I was struggling with the way I was feeling as I was writing it. There was anger in it. And I couldn't get myself out of it. So I'm like, let's just take a break, go make coffee.
Mhm.
So I go downstairs, and as soon as I got back up, I went, oh my God, I just did it. So in the book, I shared the story of my journey of getting coffee. I went downstairs and I realized, see, this is what people don't realize. In every waking moment, we're taking in sensory information from all over the place that's creating emotions. So as I'm making coffee, my feet are standing on the cold tile floor. That triggered a memory, and this is where my anger came from. That triggered a memory. When I was a kid, I ran extremely high fevers. And so my mom used to submerge me in ice baths. I hate the cold. It
Mhm.
produces severe rage. Then I grabbed the warmth of the coffee, which calmed me down, but I saw popcorn on the table, went over, grabbed a mouthful, immediately felt shame and guilt because been working on losing weight. Now I'm feeling that. Turn the corner, head up the stairs. A loud car goes by and honks. Just irritated me because, and then I remembered my dad had a booming voice and would scream out my name, Kenneth, whenever I was in trouble. And my older brother used to scream in my ear when I was asleep. So I was having all of these emotions just getting a cup of coffee that
Wow.
were all based on sensory input. And that's what people don't realize is James points out, 95 to 97% of our adult life, all we're doing is reliving the subconscious programming of childhood. And that's
Mhm.
just what I did. And people are just like, well, I got coffee. I don't know why I'm frustrated. Well, that's what emotional authenticity teaches you. What am I feeling? Where in my body? What's my first memory? Do you see how I was able to retrace everything, which then explained the trigger of the cold, the shame from the food, the loud noises. The reason I was angry and frustrated is I was stuck in some pretty traumatic moments from childhood. And
Mhm.
that's why I couldn't get myself to where I wanted to be. Well, then I used the process I teach to reshape all of that and was able to then go, oh, just tell the story of what you just experienced.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. That is really helpful. And since you brought up the topic of shame a little bit there, I wanted to ask you about something that you call the shame-based false self that arises in response to these childhood hurts that you're describing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, because, I mean, I'm not trying to disparage parents, but none of us know how to be a parent. It's fascinating to me as a society that everything in life we have to go to school um, and spend decades learning, yet we just have kids with no thought. And
Mhm.
we all think, oh, I was a great parent. I know every parent's intention, but that's like asking somebody to build a space shuttle, but they don't become an aeronautical engineer. And
Mhm.
so the primary perfect imperfection that parents do is when a child is learning and growing and making mistakes, instead of pointing out that behavior is less than perfect and creating a teaching moment and all of that, they say, you're bad. What's timeout? Shame. You don't belong in this family. You're not worthy. You don't have value unless you fit this construct, which you're not even young enough to or old enough to understand. But I expect it from you because parents don't realize what a child is going through at that age. So they what they do is inadvertently, and at least it's my belief, there are parents that truly are choosing to be hurtful. Almost all parents don't choose it. It's a lack of information and understanding, and they're just replaying what happened to them.
Mhm.
And so they're doing the best they can with that information, but they haven't learned, wait a minute, when my child is less than perfect, my goal is to teach them about the behavior, not shame them as a person. And that's what happens. And so a child learns, wait a minute, it's not safe to be my authentic self. I can't be me, a child who explores. And so The only way to fit into this family structure is to develop this false persona. This is how mom and dad, even if I'm the black sheep, a black sheep of the family, has learned this is how I get attachment. I get in trouble because at least I get attention. Remember, the first 7 years of life, we're not present. And so people think, oh no, I've always been this way. I was born this way. No, you weren't. You weren't conscious of all the different calculations you made based on your parents' behaviors and imperfections, where you went, okay, the only way to survive and get attachment is to become this false self. And it's all of us. Nobody's immune from this process. It's part of being human. And so, like, again, my latest book shows how it happens to all of us and how to find it in yourself and then decide, I mean, maybe you want to stay with those personas. I'm not saying you need to change them, but if they aren't working for you, here's the process how.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned attachment and how essential it is to us. So as children, we choose attachment to that caregiver or parent over ourselves, essentially. Would
We
you
have to.
agree?
Yeah, we
Mm-hmm.
have to. I mean, they figured that out. I believe it was Poland. I always forget the exact Poland, Czechoslovakia, Eastern Bloc country. And they had all of these, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name, orphans. It
Yes.
was a big orphanage, and all they did was feed them. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
hold them, and they all died. And that's when we discovered that there are two things a human being needs. The first one is attachment. We will literally die unless we physically and emotionally attach to another human being. The second thing we need is the pursuit of our authenticity, our own morals and values, needs and wants, negotiables and non-negotiables, and our inherent power. In other words, who we were meant to be in this world. Well, as we just discussed, the first thing a child will do at the sign of any trouble is they will deny, minimize, repress, suppress, condone, and justify their parents' imperfections because they have to. If they don't, they will die because they need attachment. The second thing they have to do is drop their authentic selves, develop a false persona so they can guarantee the attachment. And so that's part of the worst day cycle that I developed, which is a bit too long-winded to get into this. My first book talks about that. But that's a process every human being has gone through on this planet. And we're fighting for attachment, but then we live our adult lives in our false self, re-victimizing ourselves in the exact same ways we were victimized as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to get this clear. Victimization isn't just being beaten or sexually assaulted. Your dad, perfect example is me asking my father for help with homework, and he'd gasp and roll his eyes. Since then, I've always felt stupid. That's trauma. That's severe trauma. It's had a lasting impact. It's my biggest shame wound that I still am working on reorienting that emotion around. And so that's a big misconception is people think, no, my childhood was fine. There wasn't trauma. Every child has been through trauma because every parent is perfectly imperfect.
Yeah, and just thinking on the parenting piece, I have adult children, and being someone who's gone through my fair share of childhood trauma, when I came into parenting, I really didn't want to do what my parents did. So I relied on the advice of the so-called experts. But as you know, in psychology or any of these self-help kind of things, it evolves, right? So what they think works at one time, they're debunking, a few years later. So I did the timeouts, I did the letting them cry in the crib. And now I realize how much that does impact that precious attachment. So I have I've forgiven myself, of course,
Sure.
because like you said, I was doing the best I could.
Yeah.
But even when you really are trying to do the very
Yeah.
best, you can be led astray.
Because you're
And
human, you're limited.
right.
We're
Yes.
not perfect. We will make mistakes as parents that leave wounds in
Mhm.
our child, and that's okay. It doesn't make us a
Yeah,
bad parent. It makes us human. And so let's just be honest about it
exactly.
and start talking about it instead of the shame. What happens is as soon as I say it, people relive the childhood shame. They go, no, I don't want to be bad because mom and dad won't love me. Whether they recognize it consciously, that's if they were to trace the feeling, they discover, oh my God, the reason I don't want to admit I made a mistake as a parent is because of what it cost me when I made a mistake as a child. I didn't
Right,
get attachment. I didn't get connection. And so I don't want that feeling again. They've
right.
never solved that. And the other thing, bringing up the parenting, the biggest mistake in every single parenting book is they never tell the parents the secret to raising a child is to go become an expert in your own childhood trauma that you've never healed because you
Hmm.
can't teach what you haven't lived.
Hmm.
And that's the biggest problem in every parenting manual is they never address the parent's need for childhood trauma recovery. And so they just pass down what they know.
So true. And this is a lot of the problem with, I'd say, a lot of personal growth. And even when you were describing the difference between emotional authenticity and emotional intelligence, I'd say that's part of it too. The authenticity piece is really getting to the root of, how our childhood, it was traumatic, regardless of what it looked like on the outside. It's how it affects you that makes it traumatic, right? And
Yes.
so that is the important part that is missing a little bit in the EQ, book and the
Yes.
EQ work that was done.
Beautifully said, because emotional authenticity is built off four pillars: truth, responsibility, healing, and forgiveness. All of us are in math, as I say, and I point out and can show it conclusively, the single greatest killer on the planet today is denial and self-deception. We are not in truth. On average, the most truthful human lies 10 to 200 times a day. Simple things about
Mhm.
not working out, whatever it may be. Those are lies. If you've ever taken a picture and then you've put filters on it, you're lying.
Yeah.
That's deception. Like there are all of these societal ways that are built into our structure where we lie nonstop. It's pure self-deception. We're not authentic. We don't know how to be. And so we don't even know that we're in deception. And so the first step is to get into truth. Well, how do you get into truth? You have to take responsibility that if there's a problem in your life, you played a part in it. It's
Mhm.
not just the other person, it's also you. Well, how do you discover both of those? You have to get into healing. And once we do those three, then we can not only forgive our perpetrators, but most of all, like you said about your parenting, you can heal the shame wound and the childhood wound by forgiving yourself. And that emotional intelligence doesn't give you any of that or any process. It's the border of the puzzle. It opens the door for people to think about emotions and be okay with emotions, which is groundbreaking. Like, I don't want
Mhm.
to minimize their impact because now companies, everybody loves, I'm EQ. Like, that's wonderful that it's okay to mention that. But as far as a process that actually provides emotional intelligence, it doesn't provide it.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, you did touch on the worst day cycle, and I actually wanted to ask you about that. So I'm not sure if you wanted to
Oh,
spend a couple
sure. I'm happy
minutes
to.
talking about it. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. Like, what is it, and how can people get out of that cycle?
um, there are four pillars to the worst day cycle: trauma, fear, shame, and denial. Every single one of us have been through childhood trauma. We're all traumatized. Now, when we experience trauma, it creates an emotional chemical addiction within us, fear. Because of that fear response and the inability to process it, and because it comes at the hands of our parents, remember what we've talked about shame, we have to drop our authentic self
Mhm.
for the connection. Now that those three are so heavy on its own, and because we're too young and underdeveloped as a child to deal with it, and still as adults, most of the country, 80% of people say they never went through childhood trauma. And those three questions, what are you feeling? where in your body do you feel and what's your first memory, prove to everybody they're all caught in the worst day cycle and just reliving their trauma against themselves since childhood.
Yeah.
They go into step 4, denial. The two most important pieces that I haven't seen other people talk about in any personal development or psychology are the shame and denial pieces. And this is where learning about this stuff really helps you, because what you learn about shame and denial, first of all, with shame is there are two things going on. For us to heal, for one, we have to get into truth that we developed a false persona as a child. Like your career tells me your false persona. I know what your childhood trauma is. Like a client of mine is a lawyer. Well, they had no voice. They're always wrong. So they're always arguing for truth. All right. Even my in my first book, my ghostwriter was like, well, what's it say about me? And I'm like, you sure you want to know? She's like, yeah. And I said, okay, well, what is it you do? I write books. Who do you write them for? Other people.
Right.
So what does that tell you? You were not allowed to have your own voice. You can't have your own words. And so now, just like it was as a child, you took care of your parents' voice and their words, and now you're just reliving that trauma against yourself. And that's what happens in the cycle. And so that's such an overwhelming truth that I am detached from my authenticity, that I am living in a false persona, but that's only half of it. We have to get into truth. And this is what's difficult about recovery is if I were to let go of these false personas that I developed for attachment, do you see what I would lose? Attachment to mom and dad, even if they're dead, even if consciously we're like, well, no, that's the deep ingrained child feeling is, no, don't make me change because mom and dad won't love me if I let go of this.
Yeah.
And that's what kicks in denial. No, it's not true. I didn't go through trauma. It's not me. I love what I do. This isn't false. And so then they pick another narcissist, another career where the bosses are, all they ever do is relive their trauma against themselves. It's literally everybody from the least successful to most successful. Your life story is just a reliving of your trauma against yourself, not on purpose, but because we're not told how the brain and body seeks to repeat what it's already experienced. It does this in everybody. Our brain is designed it takes a minimum of 25% of all of our calories to run our brain. Its solution is to repeat what it's already done. It doesn't know the difference between good and bad, right and wrong. All it knows is I'm alive. So I'm going to do this. So that explains why the domestic abuse survivor can't leave, the person with all of these things, and why people are going, here I am again. Why does this keep happening? Well, that's the brain and body reliving the trauma, fear, shame, and denial. I could put a person in a room with 20,000 people and I know who they'll pick based on their childhood trauma. I just put one of them in there and like radar, they'd come out. Oh, they're all attractive. They're just what I want. But there's something special about this one. So it's much more in depth. That's the basic idea. But again, so you have the worst day cycle consists of trauma, fear, shame, and denial. Its solution is the emotional authenticity method of truth, responsibility, healing, and forgiveness. And that's how you solve it. And so my first book lays out the cycle. My second book goes deeper in it. And then, between my book and my classes gives you the process to heal it.
Beautiful. That just sounds like a wonderful healing modality there. And we're coming close to the end. So I wanted to ask you, I'm going to link to your freebie below. So do you want to take a minute or two and just let us know what that is?
Yeah, it's the beginning process to the emotional authenticity method, where you learn the first 3 steps. What am I feeling? Where in my body do I feel it? And what's my first memory of this? It also goes in depth on the cycle, so you can start to see, oh my God, he's right. I am still stuck reliving my childhood. So it's an introductory into the opening of truth. to break that denial wall down, which is very difficult to deal with, and just kind of open the door, but get you to finally convince yourself and see by asking those 3 questions and exactly how to work them. Because a lot of people go, well, I don't have a memory of childhood, or I don't feel it.
Mhm.
It gives you the process for both of those situations and walks you through, here's exactly how you do it. And so you can start getting into truth. And depending on where you are in your journey, you'll either take immediate responsibility and learn the rest, or you may not be ready, but now you know when you are ready where you can go to take responsibility, begin the healing, and regain your forgiveness.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for offering that for our audience. And I want to thank you again for joining us. I'm so grateful for your work in the world, because to me, authenticity is just the most important thing. It has been for my healing, and it's the thing that I really prioritize and I'm still chasing after. So I'm grateful for you, and thank you again for joining us, Kenny.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.